Chapter 5, Part 1, we're going to do equivalent units, and the overall topic we're going to talk about is process costing. Now, this can be challenging, and I've made a point of making this as much like your homework as possible to get you through it. And it's just another way of trying to get the cost close to the product. But in this case, what happens if you have the same unit, you're doing large batches of it, and it's going through various departments? That's what this chapter is all about. So first, we're going to distinguish between the flow of costs in process costing and job costing. Now, job cost, what we do there is we have individual jobs. Like, for instance, say we make a boat or we make Rolls-Royce. What we would do is we would assign all the direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead to each individual job. Or another example would be if we custom make things. This is what you would do. The cost of, or a landscaper should do this, the cost of the finished jobs flow into finished goods inventory, but through the whole process, they're tracked by job. So when the job is complete, they then can transfer those costs to cost of goods sold. So let's look at this wonderful flow chart. I really like this. This is also in your textbook. So you can visualize the process. So what we do is we take raw materials and we take our wages and our manufacturing overhead, the three components. And what we're going to do is we're going to transfer them into each department on a per job. And as they go through the system, they stay as the job. So in work in process, you'd have three work in processes: job 100, job 101, job 102. So you'd have as many of these as you need. You collect the cost for the job, and when you finish the job, you will transfer that job to finished goods. And then when you complete that job, then you transfer it to cost of goods sold. So for instance, in this example, if you complete a job, um, in this example, we completed job 101, we would transfer it to finished goods, and then when it was finalized with the customer, it would go to cost of goods sold. Now, process costing. Process cost systems is a series of manufacturing processes. One might be finishing, one might be like, for instance, if it's a car, it could be making the motor, then making the frame, then attaching the motor and the frame, then doing the painting. These would all be processes. To complete a product, it has to go through this product. Another example would be a hat. Say if we made hats, we made the same hat all the time, but what we do is we first have one department, they just cut out the hats. The next department assembles the hats. The next department puts the emblem on. That would be process costing. So cost per process is accumulated and moved from one process to another process. The cost transferred to finished good inventory only from the work in process inventory of the last manufacturing process. When units are sold, cost is transferred out of finished goods inventory into cost of goods sold. Now, this is another good analogy that I like, is process costing is like a snowball. You start in department 1, and then we add on more material, more conversion costs. You remember that. That is direct labor and overhead. Then we get to department 3, and we add on more costs. And then we get to the final department, which usually is finishing. And that would be the completed product, which then transfers to finished goods. So the departments are all within work in process. So let's take a visual look at that process. So here we have, if you notice in this case, we're making jelly beans. And the first work in process in this example is made up of three departments. We have the centers, the shells, and the packaging. And each time it goes through one of those departments, we add more wages, more manufacturing overhead, and more raw materials as we go through the process. And when we complete the process, then we transfer it to the next process. And when we complete that process, we add it to the next process. And as I said, through each process, we're adding on more costs. And then when it finally gets through packaging, it then goes to inventory. Now the question is, how do you determine how much cost you transfer out after each process? And that's what this class is all about. So again, companies that use automated production processes typically use two cost categories. We remember direct materials, but remember we talked in chapter 2 about conversion costs. Conversion costs equal direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. Now, processing costs uses either this is the one we use, which is weighted average. When you use weighted average, all you really care about is completed units and ending inventory. That's what you're going to apply the cost to. If you are unfortunate enough to have to learn FIFO, which they used to try to teach you, that is so complicated because you have to look at beginning, transferred in, and ending. You have to look at everything, and it's a lot more complicated. So you're lucky. In this class, we only look at weighted average. Now, they differ only in the treatment of beginning inventory, i.e., with weighted average, you don't worry about beginning inventory. I mean, you don't worry about the costing beginning inventory. All you care about is costing transferred out and ending inventory. So that's why most companies use weighted average because it's much easier to do. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look through the process, and in this part 1, we're only going to look at how do you compute equivalent units. So for equivalent units. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about equivalent units, they are not an actual unit. It's like when they say the average family is 2.5 children. I mean, nobody has a half a child, but it's an average. And that's what equivalent units are. And what we're talking about here is how complete they are and then turning them into something that's equivalent. So the way it works is the amount of work done during a period in terms of fully completed units of output. Companies with WIP use it to determine the amount of work done in terms of fully completed units of output. And this is how we determine it. We take the number of physical units times the percentage of completion equals number of equivalent units. So an example, if we had 5,000 units that were 80% complete with costs incurred, we would say that we have 4,000 equivalent units. So that's what we're talking about here. This is the way we use this as a means of allocating the cost between transferred out and ending inventory. So now let's look at determining equivalent units. Now, here are our 5 steps, and we'll go through all 5 of these in part 2. But in this case, what we're trying to do is we'll summarize the flow of physical units and we'll compute output in terms of equivalent unit. That's what we're going to work on in this part. Now, the other part, which we have to then do next, is we're then going to summarize our total costs, compute the cost per equivalent unit, and then we're going to assign the total costs between units completed and ending work in process. So let's take a look at a problem. Okay, here we have an example. We have beginning work in process of 203,000. We have ending WIP, and they're 75% complete as to materials and 80% complete as to conversion. Now, sometimes when you look at this, they're going to tell you when it's particularly associated with direct materials. And you always want to make sure you read the problem because sometimes they'll say, instead of giving you a percentage for materials, they'll say all the materials are added at the beginning, which means it's always going to be 100%. Or they're going to say all of the materials are ended at the end of the process, and then direct materials would be 0 as it relates to ending inventory. So make sure you always look for when materials are added, and they'll tell you that in the problem. So first, we're going to summarize the flow of physical units. Now, we know what we began with, and we know what was added during the month. So that tells us we're going to have to account for 1,198,000. Now, here's what we need. We need to know how much was transferred out and what was left in ending inventory, because of the method we're using here, weighted average, that's all we care about in terms of costing. So we need to compute the output in terms of equivalent units. So they don't tell us how many were completed and transferred out, but we do know ending inventory was 153 units. Told us that in the problem at the top. We also know, based on summarizing the flow of the physical units, we know we have 1,198,000. So what we're going to do is subtract those, and that tells us how many were completed and transferred out. Now, completed and transferred out is always going to have 100% of the direct materials and the conversion. It's the ending WIP that's always going to be portioned, depending on when the materials were added, particularly. Now, this case, they're saying they're 75% complete, so we're going to take 75% of the ending units in inventory, and that tells us we have an equivalent of 114,750. We're going to do the same thing with conversion costs. We're going to take those times 80%, and that tells we have equivalent of 122,400. Now, to get our total equivalent units, we're just going to add those two together, and that tells us the equivalent units that we're going to use to determine cost per equivalent unit, which we cover in part 2. So in part 2, we're going to go through all 5 steps and the journal similar to your homework.